Section 28 of the Underground Railroad, Part 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria Kasper. The Underground Railroad, Part 3, by William Still. Section 28. Arrival from North Carolina, 1857. Harry Grimes, George Upshur, and Edward Lewis. Feet slit for running away. Flogged, stabbed, stayed in the hollow of a big poplar tree, visited by a snake, abode in a cave. The coming of the passengers here noticed was announced in the subjoined letter from Thomas Garrett. Wilmington, 11th month, 25th, 1857. Respected friend William Still, I write to inform thee that Captain Fountain has arrived this evening from the South with 3 men, one of which is nearly naked and very lousy. He has been in the swamps of Carolina for 18 months past. One of the others has been some time out. I would send them on tonight, but will have to provide 2 of them with some clothes before they can be sent by railroad. I have forgotten the number of thy house. As most likely all are more or less lousy, having been compelled to sleep together, I thought best to write thee, so that thee may get a suitable place to take them to, and meet them at Broad and Prime streets on the arrival of the cars, about 11 o'clock tomorrow evening. I have engaged one of our men to take them to his house, and go to Philadelphia with them tomorrow evening. Johnson, who will accompany them, is a man in whom we can confide. Please send me the number of thy house when thee writes. Thomas Garrett. This epistle from the old friend of the fugitive, Thomas Garrett, excited unusual interest. Preparation was immediately made to give the fugitives a kind reception, and at the same time to destroy their plagues, root and branch, without mercy. They arrived according to appointment. The cleansing process was carried into effect most thoroughly, and no vermin were left to tell the tale of suffering they had caused. Straightway the passengers were made comfortable in every way, and the spirit of freedom seemed to be burning like fire shut up in the bones. The appearance alone of these men indicated their manhood and wonderful natural ability. The examining committee were very desirous of hearing their story without a moment's delay. As Harry, from having suffered most, was the hero of this party, and withal was an intelligent man, he was first called upon to make his statement as to how times had been with him in the prison house from his youth up. He was about 46 years of age, according to his reckoning, full 6 feet high, and in muscular appearance was very rugged, and in his countenance were evident marks of firmness. He said that he had been born a slave in North Carolina, and had been sold 3 times. He was first sold when a child 3 years of age, the second time when he was 13 years old, and the third and last time he was sold to Jesse Moore, from whom he fled. Prior to his coming into the hands of Moore, he had not experienced any very hard usage, at least nothing more severe than fell to the common lot of slave boys. Therefore the period of his early youth was deemed of too little interest to record in detail. In fact, time only could be afforded for noticing very briefly some of the more remarkable events of his bondage. The examining committee confined their interrogations to his last taskmaster. "How did Moore come by you?" was one of the inquiries. "He bought me," said Harry, "of a man by the name of Taylor, 9 or 10 years ago. He was as bad as he could be, couldn't be any worse to be alive. He was about 50 years of age when I left him, a right red looking man, big bellied old fellow, weighs about 240 pounds. He drinks hard. He is just like a rattlesnake, just as cross and crabbed when he speaks, seems like he could go through you. He flogged Richmond for not plowing the corn good. That was what he pretended to whip him for. Richmond ran away, was away 4 months as nigh as I can guess, then they ketched him, then struck him 100 lashes, and then they split both his feet to the bone, and split both his insteps, and then master took his knife and stuck it into him in many places. After he done him that way, he put him into the barn to shucking corn. For a long time he was not able to work. When he did partly recover, he was set to work again. We ceased to record anything further concerning Richmond, although not a fourth part of what Harry narrated was put upon paper. The account was too sickening, and the desire to hear Harry's account of himself too great to admit of further delay. So Harry confined himself to the sufferings and adventures which had marked his own life. Briefly he gave the following facts: I have been treated bad. One day we were grubbing, and master said we didn't do work enough. How came there was no more work done that day? said master to me. I told him I did work. In a more stormy manner he repeated the question. Then I spoke up and said, Massa, I don't know what to say. At once Massa plunged his knife into my neck, causing me to stagger. Massa was drunk. He then drove me down to the black folks' houses, cabins of the slaves. He then got his gun, called the overseer, and told him to get some ropes. While he was gone, I said, Massa, now you are going to tie me up and cut me all to pieces for nothing. I would just as soon leave you would take your gun and shoot me down, as to tie me up and cut me all to pieces for nothing. In a great rage he said, Go. I jumped, and he put up his gun and snapped both barrels at me. He then set his dogs on me, but as I had been in the habit of making much of them, feeding them, and etc., they would not follow me, and I kept on straight to the woods. My master and the overseer cutched the horses and tried to run me down, but as the dogs would not follow me, they couldn't make nothing of it. It was last of August, a year ago. The devil was into him, and he flogged and beat 4 of the slaves, 1 man and 3 of the women, and said if he could only get hold of me, he wouldn't strike me nary a lick, but would tie me to a tree and empty both barrels into me. In the woods I lived on nothing, you may say, and something too. I had bread and roasting ears and taters. I stayed in the hollow of a big poplar tree for 7 months. The other part of the time I stayed in a cave. I suffered mighty bad with the cold, and for something to eat. Once I got me some charcoal, and made me a fire in my tree to warm me, and it like to killed me, so I had to take the fire out. One time a snake come to the tree, poked its head in the hollow, and was coming in, and I took my axe and chopped him in 2. It was a poplar leaf moccasin, the poisonous kind of a snake we have. While in the woods, all my thoughts was how to get away to a free country. Subsequently, in going back over his past history, he referred to the fact that on an occasion, long before the cave and tree existence already noticed, when suffering under this brutal master, he sought protection in the woods, and abode 27 months in a cave before he surrendered himself or was captured. His offense in this instance was simply because he desired to see his wife, and stole away from his master's plantation, and went a distance of 5 miles to where she lived, to see her. For this grave crime his master threatened to give him 100 lashes, and to shoot him. In order to avoid this punishment he escaped to the woods, etc. The lapse of a dozen years, and recent struggles for an existence, made him think lightly of his former troubles, and he would doubtless have failed to recall his earlier conflicts, but for the desire manifested by the committee to get all the information out of him they could. He was next asked, "Had you a wife and family?" "Yes, sir," he answered, "I had a wife and 8 children, belonged to the widow Slade." Harry gave the names of his wife and children as follows: wife Susan, and children Oliver, Sabie, Washington, Daniel, Jonas, Harriet, Moses, and Rosetta. The last named he had never seen. Between my mistress and my master there was not much difference. Of his comrades, time admitted of writing out only very brief sketches, as follows: Edward Lewis, $100 reward. Ran away from the subscriber on the 7th of November, negro slave Edgar. He is 36 years old, 6 feet high, of dark brown complexion, very high forehead, is a little bald, and is inclined to stoop in the shoulders. Edgar says he was raised in Norfolk county, has worked about Norfolk several years. I bought him at the auction house of Messrs. Pulham and Davis, the 20th of July, 1856. The bill of sale was signed by W.Y. Milmer for James A. Billisoli, administrator of G.W. Chambers, deceased. He told one of my negroes he was going to Norfolk to sell some plunder he had there, then go to Richmond, steal his wife, get on board a boat about Norfolk, and go to a free state. He can read and write well, and I have no doubt he has provided himself with papers of some kind. He may have purchased the papers of some free negro. I will give the above reward of $100 to any person who will arrest and confine him so I can get him. C.H. Gay. My post office is Laurel, North Carolina, No. 21. The above advertisement, which was cut from a Southern paper, brought light in regard to one of the passengers at least. It was not often that a slave was so fortunate as to get such a long sketch of himself in a newspaper. The description is so highly complimentary that we simply endorse it as it stands. The sketch as taken for the record book is here transcribed as follows: Edward reported himself from Franklin county, North Carolina, where, according to statement, a common farmer by the name of Carter Gay owned him, under whose oppression his life was rendered most unhappy, who stinted him daily for food, and barely allowed him clothing enough to cover his nakedness, who neither showed justice nor mercy to any under his control, the weaker vessels not excepted. Therefore Edward was convinced that it was in vain to hope for comfort under such a master. Moreover, his appetite for liquor, combined with a high temper, rendered him a being hard to please, but easy to excite to a terrible degree. Scarcely had Edward lived 2 years with this man, Gay, when he felt that he had lived with him long enough. 2 years previous to his coming into the hands of Gay, he and his wife were both sold, the wife one day and he the next. She brought $1,125, and he $835. Thus they were sold and resold as a matter of speculation, and husband and wife were parted. After the fugitives had been well cared for by the Committee, they were forwarded on North, but for some reason they were led to stop short of Canada, readily finding employment and going to work to take care of themselves. How they were received, and in what way they were situated, the subjoined letter from Edward will explain. Skaneateles, December 17th, 1857. Dear Sir: As I promised to let you hear from me as soon as I found a home, I will now fulfill my promise to you, and say that I am alive and well, and have found a stopping place for the winter. When we arrived at Syracuse, we found Mr. Loguen ready to receive us, and as times are rather hard in Canada, he thought best for us not to go there, so he sent us about 20 miles west of Syracuse, to Skaneateles, where George Upshur and myself soon found work. Henry Grimes is at work in Garden, about 8 miles from this place. If you should chance to hear any of my friends inquiring for me, please direct them to Skaneateles, Onondaga county, New York. If you can inform me of the whereabouts of Miss Alice Jones, I shall be very much obliged to you until I can pay you better. I forgot to ask you about her when I was at your house. She escaped about 2 years ago. Please not to forget to inquire of my wife, Rachel Land, and if you should hear of her, let me know immediately. George Upshur and myself send our best respects to you and your family. Remember us to Mrs. Jackson and Miss Julia. I hope to meet you all again. If not on earth, may we so live that we shall meet in that happy land where tears and partings are not known. Let me hear from you soon. This from your friend and well wisher, Edward Lewis, formerly, but now William Brady. George Upshur. The third in this arrival was also a full man. Slavery had robbed him shamefully, it is true. Nevertheless, he was a man of superior natural parts, physically and intellectually. Despite the efforts of slaveholders to keep him in the dark, he could read and write a little. His escape in the manner that he did implied a direct protest against the conduct of Dr. Thomas W. Upshur, of Richmond, Va., whom he alleged deprived him of his hire, and threatened him with immediate sale. He had lived in North Carolina with the Doctor about 2 years. As a slave his general treatment had been favorable, except for a few months prior to his flight, which change on the part of his master led him to fear that a day of sale was nigh at hand. In fact, the 7th of July had been agreed upon when he was to be in Richmond, to take his place with others in the market on sale day. His hasty and resolute move for freedom originated from this circumstance. He was well known in Norfolk, and had served almost all his days in that city. These passengers averaged about 6 feet, and were of uncommonly well developed physical structure. The pleasure of aiding such men from the horrors of Carolina Slavery was great. End of Section 28.
Section 29 of the Underground Railroad, Part 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Giordano. The Underground Railroad, Part 3, by William Still. Section 29. Alfred Hollon, George and Charles N. Rodgers. The loss of this party likewise falls on Maryland. With all the efforts exerted by slaveholders, they could not prevent the Underground Railroad from bringing away passengers. Alfred was 28 years of age, with sharp features, dark color, and of medium size. He charged one Elijah J. Johnson, a commissioner of Baltimore County, with having deprived him of the fruits of his labor. He looked fully into his master's treatment of him, and had come to the conclusion that it was wrong in every respect, for one man to make another work and then take all his wages from him. Thus decided, Alfred, desiring liberty, whereby he could do better for himself, felt that he must "took out" and make his way to Canada. Nevertheless, he admitted that he had been treated pretty well compared with others. True, he had not been fed very well. Elijah, his master, was an old man with a white head, tall and stout, and the owner of 15 head of slaves, at the same time a member of St. John's Church. Alfred had treasured up the sad remembrance against him of the sale of his mother from him when a little boy, only 3 years old. When he was then too young to have retained her features in his memory, the fact had always been a painful one to reflect upon. George was 26 years of age, stout, long-faced, and of dark complexion. He looked as though he might have eagerly grasped education if the opportunity had been allowed him. He too belonged to Elijah J. Johnson, against whom he entertained much more serious objections than Alfred. Indeed, George did not hesitate to say with emphasis that he neither liked his old master, mistress, nor any of the family. Without recording his grievances in detail, a single instance will suffice of the kind of treatment to which he objected, and which afforded the pretext for his becoming a patron of the Underground Railroad. "It was this," said George. "I went into the cornfield and got some corn. This made my master and mistress very mad, and about it Dr. Franklin Rodgers, my young mistress's husband, struck me some pretty heavy blows, and knocked me with his fist, etc." Thus George's blood was raised, and he at once felt that it was high time to be getting away from such patriarchs. It was only necessary to form a strong resolution and to start without delay. There were 2 others who, he believed, could be trusted, so he made known his intentions to them, and finding them sound on the question of freedom, he was glad of their company. For an emergency he provided himself with a pair of pistols and a formidable-looking knife, and started, bent on reaching Canada, determined at least not to be taken back to bondage alive. Charles was 24 years of age, a very dark-colored individual, and also belonged to said Johnson. Charles was well acquainted with his old master and mistress, and made very quick work of giving his experience. After hearing him, from the manner in which he expressed himself, no one could doubt his earnestness and veracity. His testimony ran substantially thus: "For the last 3 years I have been treated very hard. In the presence of the servants, old Johnson had me tied, stripped, and with his own hands flogged me on the naked back shamefully. The old mistress was cross too. It was some time before the smarting ceased, but it was not long ere the suffering produced very decided aspirations to get over to John Bull's dominions. He resolved to go at all hazards. In order that he might not be surprised on the Underground Railroad without any weapons of defense, determined as he was to fight rather than be dragged back, he provided himself with a heavy leaden ball and a razor. They met, however, with no serious difficulty, save from hard walking and extreme hunger. In appearance, courage, and mother wit, this party was of much promise. Arrival from Kent County, 1857. Samuel Benton, John Alexander, James Henry, and Samuel Turner. These passengers journeyed together from the land of whips and chains. Sam Benton was about 26 years of age, medium size, pretty dark color, and possessed a fair share of intelligence. He understood very well how sadly slavery had wronged him, by keeping him in ignorance and poverty. He stated as the cause of his flight that William Campbell had oppressed him and kept him closely at hard labor without paying him, and at the same time did not give him half enough to eat and no clothing. John Alexander was about 44 years of age, a man of ordinary size, quite black, and a good specimen of a regular cornfield hand. "Why did you leave, John?" said a member of the committee. He coolly replied that Handy, his master was named George Handy, got hold of me twice, and I promised my lord that he should never get hold of me another time. Of course it was the severity of these 2 visitations that made John a thinker and an actor at the same time. The evil practices of the master produced the fruits of liberty in John's breast. James Henry, the 3rd passenger, was about 32 years of age, and quite a spirited-looking article. A few months before he fled he had been sold, at which time his age was given as only 20. He had suffered considerably from various abuses. The hope of Canada, however, tended to make him joyful. The system of oppression from which these travelers fled had afforded them no privileges in the way of learning to read. All that they ever known of civilization was what they perchance picked up in the ordinary routine of the field. Notice of the 4th passenger unfortunately is missing. Arrival from Baltimore County, 1857. Elizabeth Williams. Elizabeth fled in company with her brother the winter previous to her arrival at the Philadelphia station. Although she reached free land, the severe struggle cost her the loss of all her toes. 4 days and nights out in the bitter cold weather, without the chance of a fire, left them a prey to the frost, which made sad havoc with their feet especially, particularly Elizabeth's. She was obliged to stop on the way, and for 7 months she was unable to walk. Elizabeth was about 20 years of age, chestnut color, and of considerable natural intellect. Although she suffered so severely, as the result of her resolution to throw off the yoke, she had no regrets at leaving the prison house. She seemed to appreciate freedom all the more in consequence of what it cost her to obtain the prize. In speaking of the life she had lived, she stated that her mistress was good enough, but her master was a very bad man. His name was Samuel Ward. He lived in Baltimore County, near Hightstown. Elizabeth left her mother, 4 brothers, and 1 sister under the yoke. Mary Cooper and Moses Armstead, 1857. Mary arrived from Delaware, Moses from Norfolk, Virginia, and happened to meet at the station in Philadelphia. Mary was 20 years of age, of a chestnut color, usual size, and well disposed. She fled from Nathaniel Hearn, an alderman. Mary did not find fault with the alderman, but she could not possibly get along with his wife. This was the sole cause of her escape. Moses was 24 years of age, of a chestnut color, a bright-looking young man. He fled from Norfolk, Virginia, having been owned by the estate of John Halters. Nothing but the prevailing love of liberty in the breast of Moses moved him to seek his freedom. He did not make one complaint of bad treatment. End of section 29. Recording by Greg Giordano. Newport Richey, Florida. Section 30 of the Underground Railroad, Part 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Giordano. The Underground Railroad, Part 3, by William Still. Section 30. Arrival from near Washington, D.C. John Johnson and Lawrence Thornton. John escaped from near Washington. He stated that he was owned by an engraver, known by the name of William Stone, and added that himself and 7 others were kept working on the farm of said Stone for nothing. John did not, however, complain of having a hard master in this hard-named personage, Stone. For, as a slave, he confessed that he had seen good times, yet he was not satisfied. He felt that he had a right to his freedom, and that he could not possibly be contented while deprived of it. For this reason, therefore, he dissolved his relationship with his kind master. John was about 27 years of age, smart, possessed good manners, and a mulatto. Lawrence was about 23 years of age, tall and slender, of dark complexion, but bright intellectually. With Lawrence times had been pretty rough. Dr. Isaac Winslow of Alexandria was accused of defrauding Lawrence of his hire. He was anything else but a gentleman, said Lawrence. He was not a fair man no way, and his wife was worse than he was, and she had a daughter worse than herself. Last Sunday a week my master collared me for my insolence, he said, and told me that he would sell me right off. I was tied and put upstairs for safekeeping. I was tied for about 8 hours. I then untied myself, broke out of prison, and made for the Underground Railroad immediately. Lawrence gave a most interesting account of his life of bondage, and of the doctor and his family. He was overjoyed at the manner in which he had defeated the doctor, and so was the committee. Hon. L. McLane's property. Soon after his death, travels via the Underground Railroad. William Knight, Esquire, loses a superior article. Jim Scott, Tom Pennington, Sam Scott, Bill Scott, Abe Bacon, and Jack Wells. An unusual degree of pleasure was felt in welcoming this party of young men, not because they were any better than others, or because they had suffered more, but simply because they were found to possess certain knowledge and experience of slave life, as it existed under the government of the chivalry. Such information cannot always be obtained from those whose lot had been cast among ordinary slaveholders. Consequently, the committee interviewed them closely, and in point of intellect found them to be above the average run of slaves. As they were then entered on the record, so in like manner are the notes made of them transferred to these pages. Jim was about 19 years of age, well grown, black, and of prepossessing appearance. The organ of hope seemed very strong in him. Jim had been numbered with the livestock of the late Hon. L. McLane, who had been called to give an account of his stewardship about 2 months before Jim and his companions "took out." As to general usage, he made no particular charge against his distinguished master. He had, however, not been living under his immediate patriarchal government, but had been hired out to a farmer by the name of James Dodson, with whom he experienced life sometimes hard and sometimes smooth, to use his own words. The reason of his leaguing with his fellow servants to abandon the old prison house was traceable to the rumor that he and some others were to appear on the stage, or rather the auction block, in Baltimore the coming spring. Tom, another member of the McLane institution, was about 25 years of age, of unmixed blood, and a fair specimen of a well-trained field hand. He conceived that he had just ground to bring damages against the Hon. L. McLane for a number of years of hard service, and for being deprived of education. He had been compelled to toil for the honorable gentleman, not only on his own place, but on the farms of others. At the time that Tom escaped, he was hired for $100 per annum, and his clothes found him, which hire McLane had withheld from him, contrary to all justice and fair dealing. But as Tom was satisfied that he could get no justice through the Maryland courts, and knew that an old and intimate friend of his master had already proclaimed that "Negroes had no rights which white men are bound to respect." Also, as his experience tended to confirm him in the belief that the idea was practically carried out in the courts of Maryland, he thought that it would be useless to put in a plea for justice in Maryland. He was not, however, without a feeling of some satisfaction that his old master, in giving an account of his stewardship at the bar of the just one, would be made to understand the amount of his indebtedness to those whom he had oppressed. With this impression, and the prospects of equal rights in Canada under her British Majesty's possessions, he manifested as much delight as if he was traveling with $500,000 in his pocket. Sam, another likely-looking member of this party, was 22 years of age, and a very promising-looking young fugitive, having the appearance of being able to take education without difficulty. He had fully made up his mind that slavery was never intended for man, and that he would never wear himself out working for the white people for nothing. He wanted to work for himself, and enjoy the benefits of education, etc. Bill Scott, another member of the McLane party, was 21 years of age, fat and slick, and fully satisfied that Canada would agree with him in every particular. Not a word did he utter in favor of Maryland, but said much against the manner in which slaves were treated, how he had felt about the matter, etc. Abe was also from the McLane estate. He possessed apparently more general intelligence than either of his companions. He was quite bright-witted, a ready talker, and with his prospects he was much satisfied. He was 22 years of age, black, good-looking, and possessed very good manners. He represented that his distinguished master died, leaving 13 head of slaves. His, Abe's, father, Tom's mother, and the mother of the Scotts were freed by McLane. Strong hopes were entertained that before the old man's death he would make provision in his will for the freedom of all the other slaves. When he died, the contrary was found to be the fact. They were still left in chains. The immediate heirs consisted of 6 sons and 5 daughters, who moved in the first circle, were very wealthy and aristocratic. Abe was conversant with the fact that his master, the Honorable L. McLane, was once secretary under President Jackson, that he had been sent to England on a mission for the government, and that he had served 2 terms in Congress. Some of the servants, Abe said, were treated pretty well, but some others could not say anything in the master's favor. Upon the whole, however, it was manifest that the McLane slaves had not been among the number who had seen severe hardships. They came from his plantation in Cecil County, Maryland, where they had been reared. In order to defend themselves on the Underground Railroad, they were strongly armed. Sam had a large horse pistol and a butcher knife. Jack had a revolver. Abe had a double-barreled pistol and a large knife. Jim had a single-barreled pistol and counted on blowing a man down if anyone touched him. Bill also had a single-barreled pistol, and when he started resolved to come through or die. Although this party was of the class said to be well-fed, well-clothed, and not overworked, yet to those who heard them declare their utter detestation of slavery, and their determination to use their instruments of death, even to the taking of life, rather than again be subjected to the yoke, it was evident that even the mildest form of slavery was abhorrent. They left neither old nor young masters, whom they desired to serve any longer, or look up to for care and support. Jack, who was not of the McLane party, but who came with them, had been kept in ignorance with regard to his age. He was apparently middle-aged, medium size, dark color, and of average intelligence. He accused William Knight, a farmer, of having enslaved him contrary to his will or wishes, and averred that he fled from him because he had used him badly, and kept mean overseers. Jack said that his master owned 6 farms, and kept 3 overseers to manage them. The slaves numbered 21 head. The names of the overseers were given in the following order: Alfred King, Jimmy Allen, and Thomas Broxton. In speaking of their habits, Jack said that they were very smart when the master was about, but as soon as he was gone they would instantly drop back. They were all mean, but the old boss was meaner than them all, and the overseers were fraider of him than what I was, said Jack. His master, Mr. Knight, had a wife and 7 children, and was a member of the Episcopal Church, in good and regular standing. He was rich, and, with his family, moved in good society. His wife was too stingy to live, and if she was to die, she would die holding on to something, said Jack. Jack had once had a wife and 3 children, but as they belonged to a slaveholder, Jim Price, Jack's rights were wholly ignored, and he lost them. End of section 30. Recording by Greg Giordano. Newport Richey, Florida.
Section 31 of the Underground Railroad, Part 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michelle Fry. The Underground Railroad, Part 3, by William Still, Section 31. Arrival from Hartford County, 1857. John Myers. John fled from under the yoke of Dr. Joshua R. Nelson until within 2 years of Jack's flight. The doctor had been a very fine man, with whom Jack found no fault. But suddenly his mode of treatment changed. He became very severe. Nothing that Jack could do met the approval of the doctor. Jack was constantly looked upon with suspicion. The very day that Jack fled, 4 men approached him, the doctor one of them, with line in hand. That sign was well understood, and Jack resolved that they should not get within tying distance of him. "I dodged them," said Jack. Never afterwards was Jack seen in that part of the country, at least as long as a fetter remained. The day that he dodged, he also took the Underground Railroad, and although ignorant of letters, he battled his way out of Maryland and succeeded in reaching Pennsylvania and the committee. He was obliged to leave 4 children behind: John, Abraham, Jane, and Ellen. Jack's wife had been freed and had come to Philadelphia 2 years in advance of him. His master evidently supposed that Jack would be mean enough to wish to see his wife, even in a free state, and that no slave with such an unnatural desire could be tolerated or trusted, that the sooner such articles were turned into cash, the better. This, in substance, was the way Jack accounted for the sudden change which had come over his master. In defense of his course, Jack referred to the treatment which he had received while in servitude under his old master in something like the following words: "I served under my young master's father 35 years, and from him received kind treatment. I was his head man on the place, and had everything to look after." Arrival from Maryland, 1857. William Lee, Susan Jane Boyle, and Marian Lucretia Rister. Although these 3 passengers arrived in Philadelphia at the same time, they did not come from Maryland together. William Lee found himself under the yoke on a farm in the possession of Zachariah Merica, who, William said, was a, quote, "low, ignorant man, not above a common wood chopper, and owned no other slave property than William." End quote. Against him, however, William brought no accusation of any very severe treatment. On the contrary, his master talked sometimes, quote, "as though he wanted to be good and get religion, but said he could not while he was trying to be rich." End quote. Everything looked hopeless in William's eyes, so far as the master's riches and his own freedom were concerned. He concluded that he would leave him the bag to hold alone. William therefore laid down the shovel and the hoe, and without saying a word to his master, he took his departure under the privacy of night for Canada. William represented the white and colored races about equally. He was about 27 years of age, and looked well fitted for a full day's work on a farm. Susan Jane came from Newmarket, near Georgetown Crossroads, where she had been held to unrequited labor by Hezekiah Maston, a farmer. Although he was a man of fair pretensions and a member of the Methodist Church, he knew how to draw the cords very tightly with regard to his slaves, keeping his feet on their necks, to their sore grievance. Susan endured his bad treatment as long as she could, then left, destitute and alone. Her mother and father were at the time living in Elkton, Maryland. Whether they ever heard what became of their daughter is not known. Marian was 21 years of age, a person of light color, medium size, with a prepossessing countenance, and smart. She could read, write, and play on the piano. From a child, Marian had been owned by Mrs. Elizabeth Key Scott, who resided near Braceville, but at the time of her flight she was living at Westminster in the family of a man named Boyle, said to be the clerk of the court. In reference to treatment, Marian said, "I have always been used very well, have had it good all my life, etc." This was a remarkable case, and at first somewhat staggered the faith of the committee, but they could not dispute her testimony, consequently they gave her the benefit of the doubt. She spoke of having a mother living in Hagerstown by the name of Marian Ballard, also 3 sisters who were slaves, and 2 who were free. She also had a brother in chains in Mississippi. Arrival from Norfolk, Virginia, 1857. William Carney and Andrew Allen. William was about 51 years of age, a man of unmixed blood. Physically he was a superior man, and his mental abilities were quite above average for his class. He belonged to the estate of the late Mrs. Sarah Twine, who bore the reputation of being a lady of wealth, and owned 112 slaves. Most of her slave property was kept on her plantation not far from Old Point Comfort. According to William's testimony, of times Mrs. Twine would meddle too freely with the cup, and when under its influence she was very desperate, and acted as though she wanted to kill some of the slaves. After the evil spirit left her and she had regained her wonted composure, she would pretend that she loved her negroes, and would make a great fuss over them. Not infrequently she would have very serious difficulty with her overseers. Having license to do as they pleased, they would of course carry their cruelties to the most extreme verge of punishment. If a slave was maimed or killed under their correction, it was no loss of theirs. One of the overseers, by the name of Bill Anderson, once shot a young slave man called Luke, and wounded him so seriously that he was not expected to live. At another time, one of the overseers beat and kicked a slave to death. This barbarity caused the mistress to be very much stirred up, and she declared that she would not have any more white overseers, condemned them for everything, and decided to change her policy in future, and to appoint her overseers from her own slaves, setting the property to watch the property. This system was organized, and times were somewhat better. William had been hired out almost his entire life. For the last 12 to 15 years he had been accustomed to hire his time for $130 per annum. In order to meet this demand he commonly resorted to oystering. By the hardest toil he managed to maintain himself and family in a humble way. For the last 20 years, prior to his escape, the slaves had constantly been encouraged by their mistress's promise to believe that at her death all would be free, and transported to Liberia, where they would enjoy their liberty and be happy the remainder of their days. With full faith in her promises, year by year, the slaves awaited her demise with as much patience as possible, and often prayed that her time might be shortened for the general good of the oppressed. Fortunately, as the slaves thought, she had no children or near relatives to deprive them of their just and promised rights. In November, previous to William's escape, her long-looked-for dissolution took place. Every bondman who was old enough to realize the nature and import of the change felt a great anxiety to learn what the will of their old mistress said, whether she had actually freed them or not. Alas! When the secret was disclosed, it was ascertained that not a fetter was broken, not a bond unloosed, and that no provision whatever had been made looking towards freedom. In this sad case, the slaves could imagine no other fate than soon to be torn asunder and scattered. The fact was soon made known that the high sheriff had administered on the estate of the late mistress. It was therefore obvious enough to William and the more intelligent slaves that the auction block was near at hand. The trader, the slave pen, the auction block, the coffle gang, the rice swamp, the cotton plantation, bloodhounds, the cruel overseers loomed up before him as they had never done before. Without stopping to consider the danger, he immediately made up his mind that he would make a struggle, cost what it might. He knew of no other way to escape than the Underground Railroad. He was shrewd enough to find an agent who gave him private instructions, and to whom he indicated the desire to travel north on said road. On examination he was deemed reliable, and a mutual understanding was entered into between William and one of the accommodating captains running on the Richmond and Philadelphia line, to the effect that he, William, should have a first-class Underground Railroad berth, so perfectly private that even the law officers could not find him. The first ties to be severed were those which bound him to his wife and children, and next to the Baptist church, to which he belonged. His family were slaves, and bore the following names: his wife Nancy, and children Simon Henry, William, Sarah, Mary Ann, Elizabeth, Louis, and Cornelius. It was no light matter to bid them farewell forever. The separation from them was a trial such as rarely falls to the lot of mortals. But he nerved himself for the undertaking, and when the hour arrived, his strength was sufficient for the occasion. Thus, in company with Andrew, they embarked for an unknown shore, their entire interests entrusted to a stranger who was to bring them through difficulties and dangers, seen and unseen. Andrew was about 24 years of age, very tall, quite black, and bore himself manfully. He, too, was of the same estate that William belonged to. He had served on the farm as a common farm laborer. He had it, sometimes rough and sometimes smooth, to use his own language. The fear of what awaited the slaves prompted Andrew to escape. He, too, was entangled with a wife and one child, with whom he parted only as a friend parts with a companion when death separates them. Kathrine was the name of Andrew's wife, and Anna Clarissa the name of his child left in chains. End of section 31. Arrival from Hartford County, 1857. John Myers.
Section 32 of the Underground Railroad, Part 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Giordano. The Underground Railroad, Part 3, by William Still. Section 32. Arrival from Hooperville, Maryland, 1857. James Kane, General Andrew Jackson, and Anna Perry. These passengers came from the field where as slaves very few privileges had been afforded them. Jim was about 35 years of age, a dark brown skin, with average intellect for one in his condition. He had toiled under John Burnham in Dorchester County, from whom he had received hard treatment, but harder still from his mistress. He averred that she was the cause of matters being so hard with the slaves on the place. Jim contented himself under his lot as well as be could until within a short time of his escape, when he learned that measures were on foot to sell him. The fear of this change brought him directly to meditate upon a trip to Canada. Being a married man, he found it hard to leave his wife, Mary, but as she was also a slave, and kept in the employment of her owners at some distance from where he lived, he decided to say nothing to her of his plans, but to start when ready and do the best he could to save himself, as he saw no chance of saving her. General Andrew Jackson. When the above article gave the committee his name, they were amused and thought that he was simply jesting, having done a smart thing in conquering his master by escaping. But on a fuller investigation they found that he really bore the name, and meant to retain it in Canada. It had been given him when a child, and in slavery he had been familiarly called Andy, but since he had achieved his freedom he felt bound to be called by his proper name. General Andrew was about 27 years of age, a full black, and a man of extraordinary muscular powers, with coarse hard features, such as showed signs that it would not be safe for his master to meddle with him when the general's blood was up. He spoke freely of the man who claimed him as a slave, saying that his name was Shepherd Houston of Lewistown, Delaware, and that he owned 7 head of God's poor, whom he compelled to labor on his farm without a cent of pay, a day's schooling, or an hour's freedom. Furthermore, that he was a member of the Ebenezer Methodist Church, a class leader, and an exhorter, and in outward show passed for a good Christian. But in speaking of his practical dealings with his slaves, General said that he worked them hard, stinted them shamefully for food, and kept them all the time digging. Also in testifying with regard to the weaker vessel, under whose treatment he had suffered much, the General said that his master's wife had a meaner disposition than he had. She pretended to belong to church too, said General, but it was nothing but deceit. This severe critic could not read, but he had very clear views on the ethics of his master and mistress, agreeing with Scripture concerning whited sepulchres, etc. The question of Christian slave holders for a great while seriously puzzled the wise and learned, but for the slave it was one of the easiest of solution. All the slaves came to the same conclusion, notwithstanding the teaching of slaveholders on the one idea, that servants should obey their masters, etc. General had a brother in Baltimore, known by the name of Josephus, also 2 sisters, Anna and Annie. His father was living at Cannon's Ferry. Anna Perry was the intended of General. She was about 19 years of age, of a dark brown color, and came from the same neighborhood. According to law, Anna was entitled to her freedom, but up to the time of her escape she had not been permitted to enjoy the favor. She found that if she would be free, she would have to run for it. John Smith, a better specimen of one who had been ill-treated, and in every way uncared for, could not be easily found. In speech, manners, and whole appearance he was extremely rude. He was about 20 years of age, and in color was of a very dark hue. That John had received only the poorest kind of Cordfield fare was clearly evidenced both by body and mind. Master George H. Morgan was greatly blamed for John's deficiencies. It was on his farms, under mean overseers, that John had been crushed and kept under the harrow. His mother, Mary Smith, he stated, his master had sold away to New Orleans some 2 years before his escape. The sad effect that this cruel separation had upon him could only be appreciated by hearing him talk of it in his own untutored tongue. Being himself threatened with the auction block, he was awakened to inquire how he could escape the danger, and very soon learned that by following the old methods which had been used by many before him, resolution and perseverance, he might gain the victory over master and overseers. As green as he seemed, he had succeeded admirably in his undertaking. Arrival from Maryland, 1858. George Russell and James Henry Thompson. James, for convenience sake, was supplied with 2 other names, Milton Brown and John Johnson, not knowing exactly how many he would need in freedom, or which would be the best adapted to keep his whereabouts the most completely veiled from his master. George reported that he fled from Henry Harris, who lived near Baltimore on the Peach Orchard Road, and that he had lived with said Harris all his life. He spoke of him as being a blustering man, who never liked the slaves to make anything for themselves. George bore witness that the usage which he had received had been hard. Evidently his intellect had been seriously injured by what he had suffered under his taskmaster. George was of a very dark hue, but not quite up to medium size. James Henry Thompson did not accompany George, but met him at the station in Philadelphia. He contrasted favorably with George, being about 28 years of age, with a countenance indicative of intelligence and spirit. He was of a chestnut color and of average size. He charged one Dennis Maynard of Johnsonville with being his personal enemy, as an oppressor, and added that he could say nothing good of him. He could say, however, that Maynard was bitterly opposed to a slave's learning how to read, would not listen to the idea of giving them any privileges, and tried to impress them with the idea that they needed to know nothing but simply how to work hard for the benefit of their masters and mistresses. In fulfilling these conditions faithfully, the end for which they had been designed would be accomplished, according to his doctrine. Notwithstanding so much pains had been resorted to throughout the South to impress these ideas upon the slaves, no converts were made. James thought the doctrine was infamous, and that it was dangerous to live with such a man as his master. That freedom was as much his right as it was his master's, and so he resolved to leave for Canada as soon as he could see any chance for escape. Arrival from Queen Anne County, 1858. Kathrine Jones and son Henry, Etna Elizabeth Dalfus, and George Nelson Washington. These passengers, although interesting and manifesting a strong desire to be free, had no remarkable tales of personal suffering to relate. Their lot had evidently been cast among the more humane class of slaveholders, who had acted towards their slaves with some moderation. Kathrine was 24 years of age, of a dark chestnut color, possessed a fair share of mother wit, and was fitted to make a favorable impression. In no degree whatever did she think well of slavery. She had had, as she thought, sufficient experience under Joshua Duvall, who professed to own her, to judge as to the good or evil of the system. While he was by no means considered a hard man, he would now and then buy and sell a slave. She had no fault to find with her mistress. Etna was about 20 years of age, of a gingerbread color, modest in demeanor, and appeared to have a natural capacity for learning. She was also from under the Duval yoke. In setting forth her reasons for escaping, she asserted that she was tired of slavery, and an unbeliever in the doctrine that God made colored people simply to be slaves for white people. Besides, she had a strong desire to see her friends in Canada. George also escaped from Duval, Happily he was only about 19 years of age, not too old to acquire some education and do well by himself. He was greatly elated at the prospect of freedom in Canada. William Henry was a plump little fellow, only 2 years of age. At the old price, $5 per pound, he was worth something, fat as he was. Being in the hands of his mother, the committee considered him a lucky child. Arrival from Baltimore, Elijah Bishop and William Williamson. Elijah represented to the committee that he had been held under the enthrallment of a common gambler and drunkard, who called himself by the name of Campbell, and carried on his sporting operations in Baltimore. Under this gambler, Elijah had been wronged up to the age of 28 years, when he resolved to escape. Having had several opportunities of traveling through the United States and South America with his sporting master, he managed to pick up quite an amount of information. For the benefit of Elijah's relatives, if any should have occasion to look for particulars concerning this lost individual, we add that he was a spare-built man of a dark color. William Williamson fled from Mrs. Rebecca Davidge, of Perry Manville. He declared that he had been used badly, had been worked hard, and had been fed and clothed but poorly. Under such treatment he had reached his 24th year. Being of a resolute and determined mind, and feeling considerably galled by the burdens heaped upon him, he resolved that he would take his chances on the Underground Railroad. The only complaint that he had to make against his mistress was, that she hired him to a man named Smith, a farmer, and a slaveholder of the meanest type, in William's opinion. For many a day William would hold her responsible for abuses he received from him. End of section 32. Recording by Greg Giordano. Newport Richey, Florida. Section 33 of the Underground Railroad, Part 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Giordano. The Underground Railroad, Part 3, by William Still. Section 33. Arrival from Dunwoody County, 1858. Darius Harris. One of the most encouraging signs connected with the travel via the Underground Railroad was that passengers traveling thereon were, as a general thing, young and of determined minds. Darius, the subject of this sketch, was only about 21 when he arrived. It could be seen in his looks that he could not be kept in the prison house, unless constantly behind bars. His large head and its formation indicated a large brain. He stated that Thomas H. Hamlin, a hard case, living near Dunwoody, had professed to own him. Darius alleged that this same Hamlin, who had thus stripped him of every cent of his earnings, was doing the same thing by 60 others, whom he held in his grasp. With regard to feeding and clothing, Darius set Hamlin down as very hoggish. He also stated that he would sell slaves whenever he could. He, Darius, had been hired out in Petersburg from the age of 10. For the last 3 years previous to his escape, he had been bringing $150 a year into the coffers of his owners. And Darius had not been ignorant of the cruelties of the slave system up to the time of his escape, for the fetters had been galling his young limbs for several years. Especially had the stringent slave laws given him the horrors. Loathing the system of slavery with his whole heart, he determined to peril his all in escaping therefrom. Seeking diligently, he had found a means by which he could carry his designs into execution. In the way of general treatment, however, Darius said that bodily he had escaped abuses tolerably well. He left in slavery his father and mother, 4 brothers and 1 sister. He arrived by one of the Richmond boats. Arrived from Alexandria, Virginia, 1857. Townsend Derricks. The above-named escaped from a Dutchman by the name of Gally Papik, who was in the confectionery business. For the credit of our German citizens, it may be said that slaveholders within their ranks were very few. This was a rare case. The committee were a little curious to know how the German branch of civilization conducted when given unlimited control over human beings. In answering the requisite questions, and in making his statement, Townsend gave entire satisfaction. His German master he spoke of as being a tolerably fair man, considering his origin, At least he, Townsend, had not suffered much from him, but he spoke of a woman, about 60, who had been used very badly under this Dutchman. He not only worked her very hard, but at the same time he would beat her over the head, and in that most savage manner. His mistress was also Dutch, a great swabby, fat woman, with a very ill disposition. Master and mistress were both members of the Episcopal Church. Mistress drank. That was the reason she was so disagreeable. Townsend had been a married man for about 7 months only. In his effort to obtain his own freedom, he sought diligently to deliver his young wife. They were united heart and hand in the one great purpose to reach free land. But unfortunately the pursuers were on their track. The wife was captured and carried back, but the husband escaped. It was particularly with a view of saving his poor wife that Townsend was induced to peril his life, for she, the wife, was not owned by the same party who owned Townsend, and was on the eve of being taken by her owners some 50 miles distant into the country, where the chances for intercourse between husband and wife would no longer be favorable. Rather than submit to such an outrage, Townsend and his wife made the attempt aforementioned. Arrival from Maryland, 1858. Edward Carroll. Edward, a youthful passenger about 21 years of age, slow of speech, with a stammering utterance, and apparently crushed in spirits, claimed succor and aid of the committee. At first the committee felt a little puzzled to understand how one, apparently so deficient, could succeed in surmounting the usual difficulties consequent upon traveling via the Underground Railroad. But in conversing with him they found him possessed of more intelligence than they had supposed. Indeed, they perceived that he could read and write a little, and that what he lacked in aptness of speech he supplied as a thinker, and although he was slow he was sure. He was owned by a man named John Lewis, who also owned about 70 head of slaves, whom he kept on farms near the mouth of the Sassafras River in Sussex County. Lewis had not only held Edward in bondage, but had actually sold him, with 2 of his brothers, only the Saturday before his escape, to a Georgia trader named Durant, who was to start south with them on the subsequent Monday. Moved almost to desperation at their master's course in thus selling them, the 3 brothers, after reflection, determined to save themselves if possible, and without any definite knowledge of the journey, they turned their eyes toward the North Star, and under the cover of night they started for Pennsylvania, not knowing whether they would ever see the goodly land of freedom. After wandering for about 2 weeks, having been lost often and compelled to lie out in all weathers, a party of pursuers suddenly came upon them. Both parties were armed. The fugitives therefore resolved to give their enemies battle before surrendering. Edward felt certain that one of the pursuers received a cut from his knife, but the extent of the injury was unknown to him. For a time the struggle was of a very serious character. By using his weapon skillfully, however, Edward managed to keep the handcuff off of himself, but was at this point separated from his 2 brothers. No further knowledge of them did he possess. Nevertheless he trusted that they had succeeded in fighting their way through to freedom. How any were successful in making their escape under such discouraging circumstances is a marvel. Edward took occasion to review his master's conduct, and said that he could not recommend him, as he would drink and gamble, both of which were enough to condemn him in Edward's estimation, even though he were passable in other respects. But he held him doubly guilty for the way that he acted in selling him and his brothers. So privately had his master transacted business with the trader, that they were within a hair's breadth of being handcuffed, ere they knew that they were sold. Probably no outrage will be remembered with feelings of greater bitterness than this proceeding on the part of the master. Yet, when he reflected that he was thereby prompted to strike for freedom, Edward was disposed to rejoice at the good which had come out of the evil. Arrival from Petersburg, 1858. James Mason. This passenger brought rare intelligence respecting the manner in which he had been treated in slavery. He had been owned by a lady named Judith Burton, who resided in Petersburg, and was a member of the Baptist Church. She was the owner of 5 other slaves. James said that she had been the same as a mother to him, and on the score of how he came to escape, he said, "I left for no other cause than to simply get my liberty." This was an exceptional case, yet he had too much sense to continue in such a life in preference to freedom. When he fled he was only 24 years of age. Had he remained, therefore, he might have seen hard times before he reached old age. This fact he had well considered, as he was an intelligent young man. Arrival from Maryland, Robert Carr. $300 reward. Ran away from the subscriber on the 26th December, 1857. Negro man, Robert Carr. He had been when last seen on West River, a close-bodied blue cloth coat with brass buttons, drab pantaloons, and a low crown and very narrow brim beaver hat. He wore a small goatee, is pleasant when spoken to, and very polite. About 5 feet 10 inches high, copper-colored. I will give $125 if taken in Anne Arundel, Prince George's, Calvert, or Montgomery County. $150 if taken in the city of Baltimore, or $300 if taken out of the state and secured so that I get him again. Thomas J. Richardson, West River, Anne Arundel County, Maryland. Robert was too shrewd to be entrapped by the above reward. He sat down and counted the cost before starting. Then, with his knowledge of slaveholders, when traveling he was cautious enough not to expose himself by day or night where he was liable to danger. He had reached the age of 30, and despite the opposition he had had to encounter, unaided he had learned to read, which, with his good share of native intelligence, he found of service. Whilst Robert did not publish his mistress, he gave a plain statement of where he was from, and why he was found in the city of brotherly love in the dead of winter, in a state of destitution. He charged the blame upon a woman, whose name was Richardson, who, he said, was quite a fighter, and was never satisfied, except when quarreling and fighting with some of the slaves. He also spoke of a certain T.J. Richardson, a farmer, and a very driving man, who was in the habit of oppressing poor men and women by compelling them to work in his tobacco, corn, and wheat fields, without requiting them for their labor. Robert felt that if he could get justice out of said Richardson, he would be the gainer to the amount of more than $1,000 in money, besides heavy damages for having cheated him out of his education. In this connection he recalled the fact of Richardson's being a member of the church, and in a sarcastic manner added that his religious pretensions might pass among slaveholders, but that it would do him no good when meeting the judge above. Being satisfied that he would there meet his deserts, Robert took a degree of comfort therefrom. End of section 33. Recording by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida. Section 34 of the Underground Railroad, Part 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Giordano. The Underground Railroad, Part 3, by William Still. Section 34. Arrival of a party of 6, 1858. Plymouth Cannon, Horatio Wilkinson, Lemuel Mitchell, Josiah Mitchell, George Henry Ballard, and John Mitchell. Thomas Garrett announced the coming of this party in the subjoined letter. Wilmington, 2nd month, 5th, 1858. Esteemed friend, William Still, I have information of 6 able-bodied men that are expected here tomorrow morning. They may, tomorrow afternoon or evening, take the cars at Chester, and most likely reach the city between 11 and 12 at night. They will be accompanied by a colored man that has lived in Philadelphia and is free. They may think it safer to walk to the city than to go in the cars, but for fear of accident it may be best to have someone at the cars to look out for them. I have not seen them yet, and cannot certainly judge what will be best. I gave a man $3 to bring those men 15 miles tonight, and I have been 2 miles in the country this afternoon, and gave a colored man $2 to get provisions to feed them. Hoping all will be right, I remain thy friend, Humanitas. Arriving as usual in due time, these fugitives were examined, and all found to be extra field hands. Plymouth was 42 years of age, of a light chestnut color, with keen eyes and a good countenance, and withal possessed of shrewdness enough to lead double the number that accompanied him. He had a strong desire to learn to read, but there was no possible way of his gaining the light. This he felt to be a great drawback. The name of the man who had made merchandise of Plymouth was Nat Horsey, of Horsey's Crossroads. The most striking characteristic in Horsey's character, according to Plymouth's idea, was, that he was very hard to please, did not know when a slave did enough, had no idea that they could get tired, or that they needed any privileges. He was the owner of 6 slaves, was engaged in farming and mercantile pursuits, and the postmaster of the borough in which he lived. When Plymouth parted with his wife with a full heart, he bade her good night, without intimating to her that he never expected to see her again in this world. She evidently supposed that he was going home to his master's place as usual, but instead he was leaving his companion and 3 children to wear the yoke as hitherto. He sympathized with them deeply, but felt that he could render them no real good by remaining. He could neither live with his wife, nor could he have any command over one of his children. Slavery demanded all, but allowed nothing. Notwithstanding, Plymouth admitted that he had been treated even more favorably than most slaves. The family thus bound consisted of his wife Jane and 4 children, as follows: Dorsey, William Francis, Mary Ellen, and Baby. Horatio was a little in advance of Plymouth in years, being 44 years of age. His physical outlines gave him a commanding appearance for one who had worn the yoke as he had for so many years. He was of a yellow complexion and very tall. As a slave laborer, he had been sweating and toiling to enrich a man by the name of Thomas J. Hodgson, a farmer on a large scale, and owning about a dozen slaves. Horatio gave him the character of being a man of a hidden temper, and after the election of Buchanan he considered him a great deal worse than ever. Horatio told of a visit which his master made to Canada, and which, on his return, he had taken much pains to report to the slaves, to the effect that he had been there the previous summer, and saw the country for himself, adding in words somewhat as follows: "Canada is the meanest part of the globe that I ever found or heard of. Did not see but one black or colored person in Canada. Inquired at the custom house to know what became of all the blacks from the South, and was told that they had shipped them off occasionally and sent them round Cape Horn and sold them." In addition to this report, he said that "the suffering from deep snows and starvation was fearful," all of which Horatio believed to be a lie. Of course he concealed this opinion from his master. Many such stories were sounded in the ears of slaves, but without much effect. Lemuel, John, and Josiah were brothers. Lemuel was 35, and might be called a jet black. He was uncommonly stout, with a head indicative of determination of purpose, just suited to the Underground Railroad passenger. He fled from James R. Lewis, a tall, stout man, very wealthy and close. Lemuel said that he fed and clothed the slaves pretty well. He had invested to the extent of 12 head. No money or privileges were allowed, and for a small offense the threat to sell was made. It was Lemuel's opinion that his master's wife made him worse than he otherwise would have been. John was 24 years of age, of unmixed blood, and of a quiet demeanor. He belonged to Miss Kathrine Cornwell of Viana. John described her as tolerable good-looking, but real bad. His sister and one other slave besides himself comprised her entire stock of slaves. According to John's story, his mistress was in the habit of telling her slaves that she did not intend that any of them should be free if she could help it. This sentiment was uttered so scornfully that it insulted Jack very much. Indeed, it was this that put the idea of Canada into his mind. The more she kept the idea of perpetual slavery before the slaves, the more Jack resolved to make her arrogance cost her one slave at least. Miss Cornwell was not only a warm advocate of slavery, but was likewise a member of the Methodist Church, under the pastoral charge of the Reverend J.C. Gregg. On one occasion, when the minister was visiting Miss C., the subject of slavery was introduced in John's hearing. The reverend gentleman took the ground that it was not right to hold slaves, said there were none in Pennsylvania, etc. The young mistress showed little or no sign of thinking otherwise while he remained, but, after he was gone, she raved and went on in a great way, and told her brother if he, the minister, ever married her, he would have to come out of his notions about freedom. It was John's opinion that the subject of matrimony was then under consideration between them. For himself, he was highly delighted with the minister's notions of freedom, as he had heard so many high notions of slavery. In reference to the labor usage under the young mistress, John said they had been worked very hard, and especially in the present year. Last year, he stated, they had hardly any meat, but were fed chiefly on herring. Seeing that it was going to be the same thing this year too, I thought that if I could make my escape to Canada I would do it. He had strong parental and kindred ties to break, but resolved to break them rather than remain under Miss Cornwell. Josiah was 23. A more promising-looking subject to represent the fugitives in Canada was not readily to be found. His appearance indicated that he was a young man of extra physical powers, at least, one not likely to turn his face again towards Egypt. Josiah's gain was the loss of Thomas J. Hodgson, above alluded to. For full 3 years this desire and determination to be free had been in Josiah's heart. The denial of his manhood nerved him to seek for a refuge in a foreign clime. George, the last named in this party, gave his age as 26. In appearance he was not behind any of his comrades. He fled from a farmer, the late William Jackson, who owned, it was said, 16 head. He had recently died, leaving all his slaves in bondage. Seeing that the settlement of the estate might necessitate the sale of some of the slaves, George thought that he had better not wait for the division of the property or anything else, but push ahead with the first train for Canada. Slavery, as he viewed it, was nothing more nor less than downright robbery. He left his mother, one sister, and other near kin. After George went to Canada his heart yearned tenderly after his mother and sister, and, as the following letter will show, he was prepared to make commendable exertions on their behalf. St. Catherine's, July 19th, 1858. Dear Sir, with pleasure I now inform you that I am well, and hope this may find you and yours the same also. I hope, kind sir, you will please to see Mr. Paul Hammond, to know when he will try to get my mother and sister. I wish him to send me word when he will go, so I may meet him in Philadelphia, and I will endeavor to meet him there, with some money to assist him in getting them. Let me know when you start for them, so I may be able to meet you there. Please, after this letter passes from you, sir, give it to John Camper. Tell him to give it to his mother, so that my mother can get it. Be careful, and I'll let no white man get hold of it. I am now living with my cousin, Levin Parker, near St. Catherine's, $10 a month. No more at present. From your friend, George Ballard. The inquiry may arise as to how such passengers manage to get through Maryland and Delaware, but it cannot be expected that the manner in which each arrival traveled should be particularly described. It might not be prudent even now to give the names of persons still living in the South, who assisted their fellow men in the dark days of slavery. In order, however, that some idea may be gathered as to the workings of one branch of the road in Delaware, with names suppressed, we insert the following original letter from what it may be worth. Camden, June 13th, 1858. Mr. Still, I writ to inform you that we stand in need of help. If ever we wanted help, it is in these days. We have been trying to raise money to buy a horse, but there is so few here that we can trust ourselves with for fear that they may serve us as Tom Otwell served them when he got them in Dover jail. But he is done for ever. I want to know if your friends can help us. We have a road that more than 100 passed over in 1857. It is one we made for them. 7 in March after the Lions had them. There is no better in the state. We are 7 miles from Delaware Bay. You may understand what I mean. I wrote last December to the Anti-Slavery Society for James Mott and others concerning of purchasing a horse for this business. If your friends can help us, the work must still go on, for there is much freight passes over this road. But there has been but 3 conductors for some time. You may know that there is but few men. Some talks, all does nothing. There is horses owned by collared people, but not for this purpose. We want one for to go when called for. One of our best men was nigh cut by keeping of them too long. By not having means to convey them, they must be conveyed if they pass over this road. Safe they go through in 2 nights to Wilmington, for I went there with 28 in one gang last November. They had to ride, for when they came to us we go 15 miles. It is hard road on travel. I had some conversation with Mr. Evans, and was down here on a visit. Please try what you can do for us. This is the place we need help. 12 mile I live from Mason and Dixon line. I would have come, but can't have time, as yet there has been some fuss about a boy who lived near Camden. He has gone away. He sees me, and my brother knows about it, but he don't. There is but 4 slaves near us. Never spoke to one of them, but once she will never goes out. Please to try and help. You can do much. If you will, it will be the means of saving ourselves and others. Answer this letter. Please to write. Let me know if you can do anything for us. I still remain your friend. End of section 34. Recording by Greg Giordano. Newport Richey, Florida.
Section 35 of the Underground Railroad, Part 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria Kasper. The Underground Railroad, Part 3, by William Still. Section 35. Arrival from Richmond, 1858. Ebenezer Allison. Eb was a bright mulatto, handsome, well made, and barely 20 years of age. He reported that he fled from a Mr. John Tilghman Foster, a farmer living in the vicinity of Richmond. His master, Ebenezer unhesitatingly declared, was a first-rate man. I had no right to leave him in the world, but I loved freedom better than slavery. After fully setting forth the kind treatment he had been accustomed to receive under his master, a member of the committee desired to know of him if he could read, to which he answered that he could, but he admitted that what knowledge he had obtained in this direction was the result of efforts made stealthily, not through any license afforded by his master. John Tilghman Foster held deeds for about 150 head of slaves, and was a man of influence. Ebenezer had served his time in the barber's shop. On escaping, he forsook his parents and 8 brothers and sisters. As he was so intelligent, the committee believed he would make his mark in life sometime. Arrival from Richmond, 1858. John Thompson Carr, Ann Mountain and child, and William Bowler. John was a sturdy-looking chattel, but possessed far less intelligence than the generality of passengers. He was not too old, however, to improve. The fact that he had spirit enough to resent the harsh treatment of one Albert Lewis, a small farmer who claimed to own him, showed that he was by no means a hopeless case. With all his apparent stupidity, he knew enough to give his master the name of a free whiskey drinker, likewise of beating and fighting the slaves. It was on this account that John was compelled to escape. Ann Mountain arrived from Delaware with her child about the same time that John did, but not in company with him. They met at the station in Philadelphia. That slavery had crippled her in every respect was very discernible. This poor woman had suffered from cuffing, etc., until she could no longer endure her oppression. Taking her child in her arms, she sought refuge beyond the borders of slave territory. Ann was about 22 years of age, her child not quite a year old. They were considered entitled to much pity. William was 41 years of age, dark, ordinary size, and intelligent. He fled from Richmond, where he had been held by Alexander Royster, the owner of 15 slaves and a tobacco merchant. William said that his master was a man of very savage temper, short and crabbed. As to his social relations, William said that he was a member of nothing now but a liquor barrel. Knowing that his master and mistress labored under the delusion that he was silly enough to look up to them as kind-hearted slaveholders to whom he should feel himself indebted for everything, William thought that they would be sadly puzzled to conjecture what had become of him. He was sure that they would be slow to believe that he had gone to Canada. Until within the last 5 years he had enjoyed many privileges as a slave, but he had since found it not so easy to submit to the requirements of slavery. He left his wife Nancy and 2 children. Arrival from Baltimore, 1858. Roberta Taylor. The subject of this sketch was a young mulatto woman, 23 years of age, who fled from the city of Baltimore. Both before and after her escape, Roberta appeared to appreciate her situation most fully. Her language concerning freedom had in it the ring of common sense, as had her remarks touching her slave life. In making her grievances known to the Committee, she charged Mr. and Mrs. McCoy with having done great violence to her freedom and degrading her womanhood by holding her in bonds contrary to her wishes. Of Mr. McCoy, however, she spoke less severely than she did of his better half. Indeed, she spoke of some kind traits in his character, but said that his wife was one of the torn down, devilish dispositions, all the time quarreling and fighting, and would swear like an old sailor. It was in consequence of these evil propensities that her ladyship was intolerable to Roberta. Without being indebted to her owners for any privileges, she had managed to learn to read a little, which knowledge she valued highly, and meant to improve in Canada. Roberta professed to be a Christian, and was a member of the Bethel Methodist Church. Her servitude, until within 4 years of her escape, had been passed in Virginia, under Mrs. McCoy's father, when, to accommodate the daughter, she was transferred to Baltimore. Of her parentage or relatives no note was made on the book. It was sad to see such persons destitute and homeless, compelled to seek refuge among strangers, not daring to ask the slightest favor, sympathy, or prayer to aid her, Christian as she was, from any Christian of Baltimore wearing a fair skin. Arrival from Hightstown, 1858. Robert Thompson, a preacher. Slavery exempted from the yoke no man with a colored skin, no matter what his faith, talent, genius, or worth might be. The person of Christ in a black skin would scarcely have caused it to relinquish its tyrannical grasp. Neither God nor man was regarded by men who dealt in the bodies and souls of their fellow men. Robert stated to the Committee that he fled from John R. Latin, a very harsh kind of farmer, who drank right smart; that on the morning he took out, while innocent of having committed any crime, suddenly, in a desperate fit of passion, his master took him by the collar, at the same time calling loudly to John for ropes. This alarming assault on the part of his master made the preacher feel as though his Satanic Majesty had possession of him. In such a crisis he evidently felt that preaching would do no good. He was, however, constrained to make an effort. To use his own words, he said, "I gave a sudden jerk and started off on a trot, leaving my master calling 'Stop, stop,' but I kept on running and was soon out of sight." The more he thought over the brutal conduct of his master, the more decided he became never to serve him more, and straightway he resolved to try to reach Canada. Being in the prime of his life, 39 years of age, and having the essential qualifications for traveling over the Underground Rail Road, he was just the man to endure the trials consequent upon such an undertaking. Said Robert, "I always thought slavery hard, a very dissipated life to live. I always thought we colored people ought to work for ourselves and wives and children, like other people." The Committee saw that Robert's views were in every word sound doctrine, and for further light asked him some questions respecting the treatment he had received at the hands of his mistress, not knowing but that he had received kindness from the weaker vessel while enduring suffering under his master. But Robert assured them in answer to this inquiry that his mistress was a very ill, dissipated woman, and was not calculated to sympathize with a poor slave. Robert was next interviewed with regard to religious matters, when it was ascertained that he bore the name of being a local preacher of the gospel of the Bethel Methodist denomination. Thus, in leaving slavery, he had to forsake his wife and 3 children, kinfolks, and church, which arduous task, but for the brutal conduct of the master, he might have labored in vain for strength to perform. As he looked calmly back upon the past, and saw how he and the rest of the slaves had been deprived of their just rights, he could hardly realize how Providence could suffer slaveholders to do as they had been doing in trampling upon the poor and helpless slaves. Yet he had strong faith that the Almighty would punish slaveholders severely for their wickedness. Arrival from Virginia, 1858. Alfred S. Thornton. The subject of this sketch was a young man about 22 years of age, of dark color, but bright intellectually. Alfred found no fault with the ordinary treatment received at the hands of his master. He had evidently been on unusually intimate terms with him. Nor was any fault found with his mistress, so far as her treatment of him was concerned. Thus, comparatively, he was happy and contented, little dreaming of trader or a change of owners. One day, to his utter surprise, he saw a trader with a constable approaching him. As they drew nearer and nearer, he began to grow nervous. What further took place will be given as near as possible in Alfred's own words, as follows: William Noland, a constable, and the trader, was making right up to me, almost on my heels, and grabbed at me, they were so near. I flew. I took off my hat and run, took off my jacket and run harder, took off my vest and doubled my pace. The constable and the trader both on the chase, hot foot. The trader fired 2 barrels of his revolver after me, and cried out as loud as he could call, "God damn," etc. But I never stopped running, but run for my master. Coming up to him, I cried out, "Lord, master, have you sold me?" "Yes," was his answer. "To the trader?" I said. "Yes," he answered. "Why couldn't you sold me to some of the neighbors?" I said. "I don't know," he said, in a dry way. With my arms around my master's neck, I begged and prayed him to tell me why he had sold me. The trader and constable was again pretty near. I let go my master and took to my heels to save me. I run about a mile off, and run into a mill dam, up to my head in water. I kept my head just above, and hid the rest part of my body for more than 2 hours. I had not made up my mind to escape until I had got into the water. I run only to have a little more time to breathe before going to Georgia or New Orleans. But I pretty soon made up my mind in the water to try and get to a free state, and go to Canada and make the trial anyhow, but I didn't know which way to travel. Such great changes in Alfred's prospects having been wrought in so short a while, together with such a fearful looking for of a fate in the far south more horrid than death, suddenly, as by a miracle, he turns his face in the direction of the north. But the North Star, as it were, hid its face from him. For a week he was trying to reach free soil, the rain scarcely ceasing for an hour. The entire journey was extremely discouraging, and many steps had to be taken in vain, hungry and weary. But having the faith of those spoken of in the Scriptures, who wandered about in dens and caves of the earth, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented, he endured to the end, and arrived safely to the Committee. He left his father and mother, both slaves, living near Middleburg in Virginia, not far from where he said his master lived, who went by the name of C.E. Shinn, and followed farming. His master and mistress were said to be members of the South Baptist Church, and had borne good characters until within a year or so previous to Alfred's departure. Since then a very serious disagreement had taken place between them, resulting in their separation, a heavy lawsuit, and consequently large outlays. It was this domestic trouble, in Alfred's opinion, that rendered his sale indispensable. Of the merits of the grave charges made by his master against his mistress, Alfred professed to have formed no opinion. He knew, however, that his master blamed a schoolmaster by the name of Conway for the sad state of things in his household. Time would fail to tell of the abundant joy Alfred derived from the fact that his heels had saved him from a Southern market. Equally difficult would it be to express the interest felt by the Committee in this passenger and his wonderful hairbreadth escape. End of Section 35. End of The Underground Railroad, Part 3, by William Still.